welcome back to our second week in our Roman series that we are doing. Rockwall Campus, bringing it to you.
There you go.
Today with me and Kyle. So last week we started with kind of a cursory glance of what the book of Romans is all about the gospel, which is good news. And we told you, though, the bad news was coming. So me and Kyle, we are the bearer of the bad news
Here
today.
it comes.
Don't shoot the messenger,
Yeah.
as they say. So verse 18, if we just dive right in. Actually, Kyle, we're looking at Romans 1:18 through chapter 2, verse 11. Kyle, why don't you quote that passage from memory?
From the whole thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. It says the wrath of God is being poured out.
No, you're reading it. You're reading it. No, I'm just joking. Why don't you go ahead and take a moment to read Romans 1:18 through 2:11, just so you're familiar with what we're talking about here. But if you go to verse 18, it just gets right to it. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Doesn't seem like people really like the topic of the wrath of God. Kyle?
Wrath is not the thing you want in your fortune cookie. The wrath of God is coming, right?
Yeah, exactly. But it is absolutely a part of God, and it's something that people should know.
Right.
And so we love to talk about salvation and heaven and all that sort of thing. But damnation and hell are a real thing as well.
Right.
Why are you smirking when I said damnation?
You can't say that word. No. But, you know, it is one of those things that the wrath and the judgment of God is part of righteousness and part of truth, but it's not the part we want to talk about.
Yeah.
Because it's painful. It's,
right.
you know, it's.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that we're mentioning in the sermon for this week is that wrath isn't really necessarily a characteristic of God. It's a byproduct of what you already said, of His holiness and of His righteousness. Right. And people don't really want God to be wrathful toward their sin.
Right.
But I think almost everyone wants their God to be wrathful toward other people's sin. Yeah. So it would be appalling to us that God could excuse Adolf Hitler of his sin, or that God could excuse Osama bin Laden of his sin, or a rapist or sex traffickers. Like, no, they need to pay. They need to burn in the hottest level of hell. You know, that's kind of what people think sometimes. Yeah. And so we want our God to have wrath toward evil and sin, because if He doesn't have wrath toward evil and sin and He just permits it, well, then He's kind of complicit in it. Right. Because He's God and He could do something about it. Yeah. You know?
Well, I mean, I kind of think the same way with like a police officer. We don't want them pulling us over, but when somebody goes flying past or driving crazy, we want them to get pulled over.
Yeah, right.
And so we want there to be a system of judgment and correctness, but we don't want it to be against us, because that makes us have to deal with our responsibility. But it is so important that we understand in love, there is discipline, there is correction, there is a right path, and we're held to that. And so, again, the easiest way for us to do it is we want wrath on somebody else. We don't want the wrath for us. Right.
So just to kind of summarize the whole rest of the passage, because we don't have the opportunity to
I'll quote
dive
it
into
later.
Yeah, you'll quote it later. We don't have the opportunity to dive all the way into it right now. But so it says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. That's the idea, is that the wrath of God is poured out against those who suppress the truth. Well, what is the truth? The truth is that there is a God, and He is God of the universe. Right. And what this passage goes on to say is that all men are without excuse, for His divine qualities and supernatural power have been made known from the beginning through creation, is what it says. And so even if you haven't heard the name Jesus, even if you haven't heard the gospel proclaimed, you should be able to just look up at the stars in the skies at night and know, man, there's a maker. Yeah. There is a power and a force in the universe that is far greater than myself. And so he says, so all men are without excuse. I was just curious about that. Have you ever been, has there ever been a moment where you were just so overwhelmed, whether it's through nature, creation, or life or anything like that, where you're just like, man, yeah, there is a God.
Yeah. And I find that in those moments, and usually a solitude, but like if you stand on the beach, and whether it's in the Texas Gulf where it's a little brown, or in Florida where it's beautiful and blue, or you see pictures that have never been to Hawaii, but you see that kind of majesty, but it's so massive of the ocean, and the waves keep moving and all this stuff is happening. You realize there's got to be some order to why this all happens and how it functions and continues. Or in the mountains in Colorado, and you just stand on a peak and you look over. I mean, you know, I've been a believer since I was a kid, so I always have been introduced that Christ or God is to be seen in this. But Romans is telling us that everyone that sees the stars and the majesty and the creation has understanding that something caused this.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, in our culture, man is trying to explain away God and just say it happened by chance.
Yeah.
But you see this majesty and you realize he is magnificently huge and runs this thing.
Yeah. I'm kind of similar to you in that when I'm out somewhere and it's dark and the sky's clear and I look up at the stars, or I remember Lauren and I took a cruise a number of years back, and we just being out there in the ocean where you can't see any land and you just see those waves and everything. So I guess for me, the commonality in those two things, anytime I just see how small I really am, that it just really speaks to me, into my soul, that, man, there is a God.
Yeah.
There's authority outside of himself. And the reason why that's important to acknowledge that there is a God is because what this passage, where it goes, is that when you reject this idea, when you suppress the truth that there is a God, that means that you also reject his standards and his ways and his designs. And then what it says it does is that because all men kind of long to have a relationship with the divine, what happens is we begin to create our own gods.
Right.
And so it says that man made images that to look like men or to look like animals, and then they worshiped those images.
Right.
And the idea with creating an idol is if you create that which is God, that really kind of makes you God.
Right.
So you can kind of appease this divine hunger inside of yourself by saying, no, I'm spiritual and I worship a God, but your God is an idol, and at the end of the day, you made that. It really makes you God. So anyway, my question to you, what do you think are some of the most common idols that people worship today? Because back then it was statues and false gods.
Yep.
What would be some idols in people's lives today?
Well, I think one of the good things that you mentioned a while ago about how we see God and we recognize him in nature in this, significant demonstration of his bigness. Sometimes people translate that beauty of nature into what they worship. Mm-hmm. So you're actually taking the God that created it and removing him, and then you worship his creation, which is magnificent and incredible. Sometimes we exalt animals to be higher than humans, which contradicts Genesis, how God created everything. Mm-hmm. But we also do just man-made religions where we create things that have a religious appearance, but don't put a supreme being at the top, or we dilute it and we create lots of gods at the top of this so that anybody can get to it in any different way. Yeah. But it is super common in the world around us, and it's been this way since time began. But we try to create something that we can understand because we want to have a divine thing to worship, but we want to understand it. Yeah. And God is so much bigger than that. We want to replace that because we give him the authority if we acknowledge him. And we look for other things. And they created out all kinds of stuff. I mean, secular humanism that's super popular right now in our culture is worshiping man, what man can do and how we can achieve and what we can accomplish and all those things. We worship that sometimes. But ultimately, the reason we substitute all these things for the real God is because we don't want to acknowledge the God of the Scripture, because then we have to abide by what he tells us.
Yeah, exactly. And so where Romans goes after that is it says that these people who suppress the truth, they don't acknowledge God, they reject God's design, and one of the places where you see that most is in terms of sexuality. And so that's where it goes in Romans chapter 1. Right. Because God has a design for human sexuality of man and woman. They leave their father and mother, they cleave to one another, and the two become one flesh. Mm-hmm. And so that is God's design. There's an order to it. It's man, it's woman, they get married, and then they consummate their sexual relationship, and that's his design. And I think one of the ways where we most see in our society and culture today our rejection of God and his standards for our life is in the area of our sexuality and the choices that we make in that area. So Kyle, what are
totally
the
agree.
worst sexual decisions you've ever made?
Well, when I was in 7th grade.
Oh,
Okay.
man, we're having fun.
Not going to do that one.
Yeah, no, let's not. Although we'll talk about that one later. But what's important to note is because oftentimes what happens is we like to fixate on other people's struggle and not really talk about our own. And so Romans 1, it does talk about sexual sin. Specifically, it talks about the sin of homosexuality. But then it goes on to talk about other things. So just in case you felt like, yeah, well, that one's not mine. Good. Whew. Like, yeah, those people are terrible. Well, then Paul goes on. He says, well, but listen, here's the other areas too. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They're gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. And then he goes on to say at the beginning of chapter 2, and if you've done none of those things, like if you've sinned in none of those areas, but you've ever judged anyone who has, well then you're guilty as well. And so the whole idea from Romans 1 verse 18 through 2:11 is that we are all equally offenders of God's standards. And anytime we sin against God, anytime we reject His design in any area of our life, we are rejecting God, we are suppressing the truth, and therefore, like verse 18 started out saying, the wrath of God should be revealed against us. And spoiler alert, thank God, He didn't want us to have to experience His wrath, and so thus He sent His Son, Jesus. And that's where Paul is ultimately getting us to. But you can't really appreciate Jesus. You can't really receive Him and accept Him until you take a real sober look at your need for Him, at your own sin. And so this isn't fun. And it's not pleasant to talk about your sin and tackle. And you may be offended by it. And the gospel starts with an offense, but then it comes right back up, followed right back up with God saying, but I've sent my Son for that to save you and forgive you. So anyway, be encouraged, be encouraged. We're going to send you off to your discussion now. Hope that this has been helpful to you. Make sure that you come back next week for week 3 of this study. We'll see you then.